We've now arrived at John chapter 5 and verse 16 through to verse 23. This is where Jesus is talking about his relationship with God the Father. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I, too, am working." For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus gave them this answer: "I tell you the truth. The Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. And yes, to your amazement, he will show him even greater things than these. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, and that all may honour the Son just as they honour the Father. He who does not honour the Son does not honour the Father who sent him." I suppose, having heard those words probably a number of times, we get familiarised with them and lose the impact. But I don't think I'm too far from the mark if I say that this is one of the most extraordinary statements I think that any human being has ever made. When you think about it and try to step back and look at it in its context, this is a man who is claiming that his relationship with God is so strong and so connected that their purposes are one, their thoughts are one, their very aim in life and the things that they do are one, and that there's nothing to distinguish between the two of them. To disrespect one is to disrespect the other. To approve of one is to approve of the other. To worship one is to worship the other. So connected is that. That's the context for this. And I don't think that there's been any instance of any human being or any leader of any religion at any time in the history of the world who has ever made such an astonishing and powerful claim to uniqueness and divinity and godlike connection. If you don't know me, then you don't know God, is basically what he's saying. But let's take it verse by verse. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. The Jews have got a very, very strong sense of what is right and wrong. In fact, their whole religion is based upon the idea of keeping to the rules, keeping to the regulations. It's a legalistic religion, a rules-based religion, and therefore an outward observance religion. It's not a religion of inward attitude, of heart and mind. In fact, you can have an attitude which is selfish, unconcerned, but provided you do the right things and said the right things and acted in the right way, that was perfectly all right. Jesus turns that on its head and says that the outward actions are not so important as the inward heart and motivations. And why should that be? Because everything, he says, proceeds from the inward heart, and that the actions that one does are conditioned and approved of and generated and propelled by what's inside a person. The inside of the person is therefore the more important thing, and the outward observance is kind of a secondary matter. It's the inward heart of a man which relates directly to God and which leads to the way in which they act. If you have faith in God, then you'll act accordingly. And if you don't have faith in God, then you'll still act accordingly. If you value the virtues of God, then you'll act accordingly. And if you don't value those virtues, then you won't act accordingly. It all stems, therefore, from the way your inward attitude is set. What is your heart set on? And time again, Jesus is pointing this out. Where a man's heart is, there is his treasure. So we have this emphasis of the inward from Jesus, but the outward is what the Pharisees were concerned about. And so, because he was doing things on the Sabbath, no matter what his inward mind might be, they persecuted him. We're not told exactly what form this persecution took, but we are told that the effect of it was to try to get him killed. How that might have been the case? Well, they might have tried to encourage the crowds to stone him, to revile him, to boo him, to whip up people against him, all that kind of thing. I imagine that it would have been a very polarizing set of events in Israel at that time. They were working actively against pulling down his reputation, pulling down his character, and doing what a lot of people do these days. A kind of ad hominem attack. This man cannot be of God because he breaks the Sabbath. That's the logic of what they would say. Therefore he must be an evildoer, and therefore he must be stopped. He's just a popularizer of things. Popular person, but one who is clearly not godly because he doesn't obey the laws that we give him to obey. So you can see their dilemma. But Jesus has an answer. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." Now, astonishing statement, because already Jesus has indicated that his relationship with God is one of Son and Father. He refers to himself as the Son, he refers to God as the Father. There is no doubt that this is a paradigm-shifting terminology. There was God and there was the people, but here we have the Son and the Father. This relationship between Jesus and his Father is one of subordination, because a son is subordinate to a father, but it's also one of filiation, it's one of connection, it's one of identity of nature, it's one of identity of purpose. The connection between a son and a father is, in earthly terms, a genetic connection, but also a cultural connection, also a purposeful connection. Families would work together, particularly in those days. Sons would take over their father's work. They would plough their father's fields. They would do the same work as the father. And there'd be a oneness, a strong connective oneness between the son and the father. The son would be carrying on the work of the father. And this is what Jesus is claiming to do with relationship to God. That's completely unique. No one spoke like this before. No one gave this kind of huge connection. Not even the most religious of the Pharisees would claim this closeness to God. They were merely the servants of God. My Father is always at his work to this day, and I too am working. So he's now looking at answering the question about why are you working on the Sabbath? And the interesting answer here is because my Father is always at his work. Now, this is a contrast with Genesis chapter 1, where we have on the seventh day God rested. And it's on that basis that the law of the Sabbath was produced and enforced, so that people were allowed to work 6 days, but on the seventh day they were forced to rest in obedience to this particular commandment. I think it's the fourth commandment, where on the Sabbath day you shall do no labour or work, and that's an important commandment, which was turned into a strict liability injunction. Nothing could be done, not even carrying your mat around or picking up anything. It was considered work. So you can see how they took these things to the nth degree. And the reason they did that was because the more emphasis you put on the finest detail, they thought, the more holy you are being. You know, people who take these things very, very seriously, and this is another phrase that we hear so often today, we take these things very seriously, we do this to the finest detail, and therefore that shows that we're really, really committed. Well, not at all, says Jesus, because although you might be committed to the fine detail, you've missed the bigger picture. And that's often a case that we find today. My Father is always at his work to this very day. If he's always at his work, what's that bit about resting on the Sabbath? Well, I suppose that's resting about the day of creation. Creation took place on 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested from creating. The creation was completed, in other words, in 6 days. But God himself doesn't rest. He doesn't rest completely from everything that he does. There are many other things that God does besides the act of creation. And God continues to work and to function and to do as he pleases every single day. So it's not an absolute rest. That you've misunderstood Genesis if you think that on the seventh day God does nothing at all. That's total misunderstanding of the very nature of God. God is always at work, always doing something, always being involved in the life of his creatures. My Father is always at his work to this very day, which means that even now, even at this moment, even on the Sabbath, God is working and upholding the entire creation and upholding life. He talks a little bit more about that in a moment or two. And therefore I too am working, may not be creating on the seventh day, but still working. So the idea that we stop functioning entirely on the seventh day is a complete misunderstanding. We work, but in different ways. We involve ourselves in different activities, but we're still working and still pursuing the good, still doing justice, still loving mercy, still walking humbly with our God. You don't get time off from doing that just because it's the seventh day. But of course, the Jews were quick to pick out that it wasn't just a justification of the work that he was doing, but for this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him, by which again we can imagine whipping up the crowds, maybe trying to stone him, maybe trying to arrest him in some sense. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, which was good enough reason to do that in their eyes, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, that's important that we understand that, because the Pharisees understood it, the Jews understood it, and we don't properly understand that today if we don't follow that. But they got that right. One thing they did get right was by calling God your Father, you were claiming a special relationship with God. You were claiming to be the Son of God, and that God himself was your Father. So there's this strong bond. There's a genetic bond. The Son proceeds from the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, to quote an old creed. But that's beside the point. It's the connection which is important here, and the uniqueness of that connection is something that you really have to see if you want to be someone who is spiritually aware and alive, says Jesus. And if you don't see that connection between me and God, then you don't understand God at all. And quite rightly, making himself equal with God, that was probably the ultimate blasphemy as far as the Pharisees were concerned, because nobody could be equal with God. And yet if you share the same heart and mind and purpose as God, then there is an equality there, an equality of heart and mind and purpose and virtue. And the children of God need to share those same characteristics of God that God himself shows forth. Anyway, they hated him for that, and Jesus gives them this answer. You're claiming to be equal to God. How can that be? That's blasphemous, Jesus. He says, I tell you the truth. The Son can do nothing by himself. In other words, you see me healing people on the Sabbath day. You see me telling people to pick up their mat and walk, and you claim that that is wrong because it contravenes the law of God. Well, I am not doing this myself. It's not my idea. It hasn't come only from me, because I can do nothing by myself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing, because whatsoever the Father does, the Son also does. So if you're criticizing me for working on the Sabbath, and criticizing me for telling a man to take up his mat and walk, which are acts of charity and mercy, then you are criticizing God, because what I do is what God himself does. And if you haven't seen that, if you haven't understood that my very actions and my very words are the very things which God himself would do if you were to see him here and now, then you haven't understood who I am, what my relationships are, and you haven't understood the weight of my words. That's the import here. He's equating his actions, his purpose, his desires, his virtues, his whole approach to life with that of God, if God were here. In other words, he is God incarnate. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he does. Now that is an important thing, because Jesus sees himself as being the recipient of the love of God. The Father loves the Son. Now can you imagine some human being talking in this kind of way? God loves me personally, individually, because I do the will of him who sent me. There's a uniqueness of this relationship, and a confidence in this relationship, and a personal knowledge which is being shared here, which is beyond and above anything that anyone has ever said before. No one has claimed this kind of relationship with God. No one that I'm aware of has ever claimed this intimate connection with the mind and the practice and the person of God, the holiness of God. I am God incarnate, is what he's saying. The character of God is displayed before you. What I do is what God does. It's astonishing. It is extraordinary as a statement, and you see it. And the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. So in other words, my relationship with God is such an intimate relationship that I am aware of all the doings of God. God has revealed himself to me in such a way that I am now intimately connected with the mind of God, which you don't have by implication, is what he's saying here. And that's because the Father loves the Son. And yes, to your amazement, and you can imagine them being scandalized, amazed is probably one way of putting it, but your amazement, your scandalized amazement of what I'm saying, he will show me, he's shown me everything that he does, but he will show me even greater things than these. In other words, even more lies in the future. Even more lies in the future which you cannot even comprehend. Such is the depth of my connection with God. It's beyond your comprehension, and it's even growing greater and greater. He will show him even greater than these, for just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, of which there were examples in the Old Testament, but we're talking also about the future, also about judgment, the day of resurrection. Just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, we're talking also about Adam and Eve bringing life into being in the first place. The one who can give life at the start is the one who can take life and the one who can restore life. Such is the nature of God himself, and only God has this power. Just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, because the power of life and death is in the hands of God, so even the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Now, what this kind of life is interesting, because it may well be that Jesus is speaking metaphorically here, on one level, that the life which he gives is the life of the spring of living water. It's the life which opens up the eyes of the blind to see the truth of God. It's the life which brings people from a state of spiritual deadness into spiritual life. And I give that gift of spiritual life to those who I am pleased to give it to. My teaching, by talking with different individuals and speaking to them, is my way in which I infuse spiritual life into those who have been moribund and dead, particularly under your teaching. But the implication too is that there is a deeper connection to this kind of life. On the first level, there's a metaphorical spiritual life of awakening to spiritual truths, and that is spoken of as life, living water life, and of the rebirth life, being born again. That's the idea of life given when speaking to Nicodemus, that you have to be born again, which is giving of life to somebody. That being born again is this idea of spiritual life. And it may be more than that too, in terms of welling up into an eternal life which will never end. So the Son gives life to whom he pleased to give it. So there's connections here with Nicodemus and being born again. Moreover, and this is moving on here, moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. Now that's a devastating comment, because you have come to judge me. You've come to say that I fail your standards. I fail God's standards because I've told a man to pick up his mat and walk, because I work on the Sabbath. You tell me, you judge me in this sense. And now Jesus turns that judgment on its head, because he says that God has entrusted all judgment to me, not to you. You are no one to judge on God's laws. I am the person to judge on God's laws. I have been the one who is entrusted to judgment. God himself has given me this role to judge you. Who are you to judge me with respect to the Sabbath? No one. I am the one who judges you in respect to the way in which you are connected with God and the way and the things of God. And I failed you in that judgment. So, moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. So I am the judge of you. You are not the judge of me. So that all may honour the Son just as they honour the Father. In other words, because I am the judge, I set the standard. I am the one that you look to see what is right and wrong. I am the saviour and the judge. I am the ideal behaviour that which you model yourself on. And if you fall short of the ideal that you see in me and my behaviour, which is reflecting the nature of God, then you fall judged already and stand condemned already by your own ideals, because you claim to embody the ideals of God, and yet I am the one who embodies those, and the Father has entrusted that judgment, that ideal, to me, so that all may honour the Father just as they honour the Son. The Son may honour the Father. In other words, the connection between judgment and honour is very interesting, but very clear. The person who acts as the ideal behaviour is the one you want to model yourself on. And because you model yourself on that person, if you fail to live up to that standard of behaviour, then you are judged by that behaviour. But that behaviour is the ideal and the standard that everyone must follow, and therefore you must honour the ideal. You honour the perfection of God's character in the life of Jesus Christ. But by honouring that character and recognising that that is the right way to live, you fail to live up to it, then he is your judge. So, because judgment is entrusted, honour is also given. He who does not honour the Son does not honour the Father who sent him. So, you're not honouring me, he says to the Pharisees, because you think that instead you're honouring and upholding the things of God. The truth of the matter is the reverse. The truth of the matter is, because you don't honour me, you're not honouring God at all. You think you are. You think you are the defenders of God, defenders of the law of God, defenders of the truth, defenders of the Sabbath. But the fact of the matter is you've completely misunderstood the requirements of God. If you had understood what God really requires, then you would honour me, because you would see those requirements lived out in my life. And so if you dishonour me, you're actually dishonouring the God who you think that you are supporting.